And that's the end of the first half. As the teams head to the locker room, the Spartans lead the Bulldogs by a score.
You guys stink.
Geez, Coach, we're only down a couple of points.
No, I mean you guys really smell. You need to hit the showers. And here, I got every one of you new bars of soap from the Sterling Soap Company. Each bar is artisan crafted using natural ingredients and essential oils. They also have shave soaps, colognes, beard balm, and a whole lot more. Now get in there.
But Coach, we have another half to play.
I don't care. I can't stand to be around you.
A few minutes later.
All right, bring it in tight. You guys are still playing terrible, but you're smelling great out there. Now listen, you're going to need to stock up for the rest of the season. We got a lot of tough games left. So go to sterlingsoap.com after the game. That's STIRLING soap.com. You got that?
Yes, Coach.
Great. Sterlingsoap.com on 3. 1, 2, 3. Sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, Old Sports, and welcome to the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I am Dan Newman, as always, joined by my brother and co-host, Andrew Newman, and this is the end of the fourth full year and the fifth year that we've done the Hello Old Sports podcast. I think we're up to something like 130 some odd episodes on everything from 19th century King Kelly baseball to the episode that you just heard posted prior to this one will be an interview with an author talking about the LeBron Lakers. So we've done a little bit of everything over the last 4.5 years, and we always wrap it up at the end of the year with the In Memoriam special, where we commemorate the lives and legacies of some of the players, owners, coaches, commissioners, sports figures who lost their lives in 2025. So glad to get through another year and glad to have the opportunity to do this again. And Andrew, how are you?
I'm doing well, Dan. This is always sort of, I think you referred to it once as like the capstone episode that we do, where it's sort of a compilation of everything in the year. And as we'll get to in a minute, we bring in all kinds of different guests and, different people, a lot of whom are also associated with the Sports History Network. And it's also a time to get to discuss some people we probably wouldn't discuss otherwise, or at least not devote this much time specifically to them. Some years, obviously, you get really well-known guys and you spend a lot of time on them. But then some years it's guys who we take a few minutes to talk about specifically. So, it really is a nice thing. It's always a little bit throughout the year, not morbid, but sort of as we look, and I'm like, well, we'll be talking about him when you see on the ticker on ESPN that they passed away or something like that. So, Dan always kind of keeps a running list as the year goes on. And, it's quite the undertaking to schedule all these different recording sessions and compile all this. So thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to getting started.
And it is definitely a different list this year in some ways. There are players, there are Hall of Fame players, and, a couple of coaches, one guy who was a player and a coach, in the Hall of Fame is both. But we also have couple commissioners this year. We have more guys who are in journalism or broadcasting or that type of thing. So it's a little bit, I don't want to say different, but it is a little bit different this year, I would say.
Yeah. There's a few guys, that I've in doing my research for the ones you and I are going to do together. And it's like, I'll admit I really had to learn a lot about them, or, I was familiar with the top line of their biography, but not much beyond that. So, with the caveat that as we're recording this, it's June 7th and
December 7th,
rather. And within the last couple of weeks, we usually get some people that get added onto the list. At this moment, some other people will get some more time than they might have in a year with some, top of the line, major people in the sports universe passing away.
So we have some guests who are patiently waiting here, so I won't belabor this too much longer, but I would just mention that kind of what you're going to hear is the episodes, and I think it usually ends up being 2 episodes, 2 or 3, probably 2 this year. You will hear them chronologically, but we record them at different times, and there's a lot of cutting and pasting. So you'll hear a segment or 2 with some different guests, and you'll hear guests who are part of one episode come back, an hour and a half later in the same episode, or even in the following episode to talk about somebody completely different. And then interspersed with that, you'll hear Andrew and I doing a bunch on our own. And we have this list that we put together, and kind of we'll go through it as Andrew said. So, without further ado, we actually have some guests for our very first person that we're speaking about this year. And I don't know, Andrew, do you want to talk about the first person and kick us off?
Sure, Dan. Gus Williams, born in 1953, passed away on January 15th. A 2-time NBA All-Star, Williams won the NBA title with Seattle in 1979 and was Comeback Player of the Year in the 1981-82 season. His number 1 was retired by the Sonics in 2016.
So we are lucky enough to have with us tonight a stalwart of the yearly In Memoriam episodes, our Sports History Network colleague, Dana Auguster, who is the former host, now the co-host of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast on the Sports History Network, and his new co-host that he just added earlier this year, Chuck Combs, and they are both with us this year to talk about Williams and also somebody else who you'll hear about in a while. And so, Chuck, Dana, good to hear from you. Good to see you all. And Dana, thanks for doing this again this year.
Once again, man, thank you. I always look at this as I said it last year, and I think I might have said this one other time, that this is like the Sports History Network's All-Star game. And I'm an all-star once again, but this time I brought a fellow all-star with me to the show. And once again, I'm still looking for that bonus check to come in, and so is Charles.
That comes from Arnie. That doesn't come from me.
I'll definitely get him on the phone and renegotiate both of our contracts. Okay, we have the same agent.
and Chuck, it's nice to meet you, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you guys so much. And I've heard so much wonderful things about your podcast, as well as both of you. And this is just a wonderful concept that you guys have, the In Memoriam and all of that. And just thank you guys so much for extending the invitations.
Well, and thank you both for doing it. Before
we get too far into this, just to not begin this on a bad note, on an inaccurate note, and as soon as it left my mouth, I was like, this doesn't make sense. His jersey was retired by USC in 2016. His jersey was retired by the Supersonics in 2004. And the way the Supersonics have not existed for a long time, I didn't know if maybe they did a ceremony for him at the arena in Seattle or something, but 04 was the Sonics, 16 was USC, just to clear that up. So we're not off. We don't want to hex ourselves with a misstatement in the first paragraph.
And that one's completely on me for an error in the very first bio that I wrote this year. So I apologize. Anyway, Gus Williams, not a Hall of Famer, not an all-time great by any means, but a guy who was very, very good for a few years and really kind of had a very kind of unique type career, if you think about it.
Yeah, he really did. Gus Williams, and to give everybody, including you guys, a little peek behind the curtain with me and Charles's friendship, is that he and I went to college together, and we would barnstorm basketball courts all around Baton Rouge, and we'd get into deep discussions about point guards and stuff like that. And Gus Williams would always come up, and he was just this really silky smooth player. I would argue that he may be the greatest player in the history of USC basketball. With all due respect to guys like DeMar DeRozan and Bill Sharman and those guys, but his jersey number 10 was retired by the USC, and his time with the Sonics, and along with his backcourt teammate Dennis Johnson, was maybe one of the most underrated backcourts maybe in NBA history.
He was just so cool. And as Dana laid out, he wasn't necessarily an all-star or, and he was an all-star a couple of times, but as you guys laid out, perhaps not a Hall of Famer, which is a bit surprising to me because usually there's not really like an NBA Hall of Fame. It's usually like a basketball Hall of Fame, which usually also takes into account what happened during your college years as well. So he had a stellar college career as his NBA career as well. And then he also had a significant cultural impact as well because, he was, like a lot of times the history of the NBA, they just talk about, well, yeah, the Celtics dynasty and against Wilt Chamberlain, and then the Knicks in the early 70s. And then basically the NBA was about to die until Magic and Bird resurrected it and then took it to a certain level. And then Michael Jordan came in and took it to unprecedented levels when that's totally inaccurate because I think players like Gus Williams, even though he was not an ABA player, he had an ABA style of game, which really kept the lifeline of the NBA alive. Like not just he, but other guys like Dr. J, obviously, Bill Walton, David Thompson, Dan Issel, guys like that. They kept it alive because there would not have been a league to save had they not kept it going the entire time until the Magic and Bird era came along. And then they played an integral role even then because, obviously Magic and Bird were the main stars, but they were the kind of the co-stars, the role players, so to speak, in helping grow the interest of the game to unprecedented heights during the 80s.
And I think sometimes guys who, especially the later part of his career in the early 80s or the whole 80s really, sort of the narrative sucks so much oxygen out of the atmosphere in terms of like, well, if you're going to talk about the 80s in basketball, it's going to be about Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. They might talk a little about the Sixers or the Pistons at the end of the decade, but especially with the Western Conference, like you almost never hear them talk about anybody in the Western Conference, any player or anything except the Lakers and, Moses Malone when he was with Houston. Like it just, the conversation gets so funneled away from really good players who just were on teams. And I know he won a championship in the late 70s, but who were on good teams, but they weren't the Showtime Lakers. So they get sort of cast aside.
Well, and here's an interesting point that I saw. And it was on Wikipedia, but I fact checked it. And I don't know if any of you guys saw this. The Seattle team that he led to a championship was the last Western Conference team to win a championship until 2023 that was not from either California or Texas. So
that's right.
44 years, because you got the Lakers, you got Golden State, and then you got the three Texas teams who all had their turn. And I just kind of jotted down. You had some teams that lost. The Jazz lost. The Suns lost. The Blazers lost. Most of these teams lost to Michael Jordan now that I'm looking at it. Even Seattle came back and lost to Jordan. So that's sort of an interesting point. But yeah, that team, and it's also, living in the DC area all these years, it was a back-to-back, one team won and then the other team won, where you had the Bullets beat the Sonics in 78, and then you had the Sonics come back and beat the Bullets in 79. What's funny to me about that is that neither of those teams really ever competed again after 79. And one of the reasons why they didn't maybe was that in 80-81, Gus Williams ended up holding out for a full season because of a contract dispute. But those teams just disappeared from the radar in favor of the LA's, Boston's, Phillies, Houston's. They were really good at the time when the NBA was really struggling. And then as soon as the 80s started, they were both just gone.
Yeah, what was also interesting about those late 70s Sonics teams is that they would split time between the Seattle Center Coliseum, which is now Key Arena. I don't even know what it is now, the home of the Kraken, but I know it as Key Arena.
I believe it's Climate Pledge Arena. Isn't that the one in Seattle?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. That sounds right. But they would also play in the Kingdom, and they would feel it. Those Sonics teams would feel it, because in one of our our last episode, we had talked about the city of Seattle as being a great sports city. And that was proof positive there, is that Seattle has always been a sports crazed city. And that was evident in those finals in the late 70s, between the Sonics and the Bullets. Gus Williams, Chuck said he was very smooth, very, very silky smooth player. And he was one of those point guards that continued the legacy of great point guards that came from the New York area. You're going to talk about one later on in this episode when we talk about Lenny Wilkens, but he was part of that legacy of great point guards from New York, from the New York area. He was from Mount Vernon. I don't know if you really consider Mount Vernon part of New York City, but in that general New York area, he added to that lineage of great point guard play in that area.
Yeah, and Mount Vernon is a perennial powerhouse in basketball. They still are. They're basically, Mount Vernon, for people who don't know, borders the Bronx. So it's right on the other side of New York City. So while it's not in the city proper, it's close enough. And they would always, because New York City in high school sports is its own entity from the rest of the state, they would always, Poughkeepsie, the basketball school by where I'm from, by where Dan's from, they were always really, really good. They would get to the section championship game, and then they'd get beat by Mount Vernon. Then Mount Vernon would go on and win the state championship. That was pretty, and this was the 90s, early 2000s. Ben Gordon played at Mount Vernon.
Well,
right.
It was even more pronounced back in this era where they were like the best team in the region, not just in the state.
Just to sort of add to the Lenny Wilkens point, and we will talk about Lenny Wilkens later on. I don't know whether it'll be this episode or next episode. We actually have two different guests coming on to talk about Lenny Wilkens. But it was Lenny Wilkens who really gave Gus Williams' career a boost, because when Williams took over as the coach in Seattle, he put Wilkens in the starting lineup in the backcourt alongside another future Hall of Famer in Dennis Johnson. And that was really what sort of kind of pushed the Sonics into the championship contender level that they ended up being in. So Lenny Wilkens, in addition to being from the same town as Williams, also plays a really key role in his Sonics career.
That's right.
Yes, just absolutely. Just absolutely. Just kind of like Lenny Wilkens just allowed him to kind of play really freely, like, and trusting them. Because to your point, Dan, with he and Dennis Johnson, they kind of both had lead guard elements. Neither, Gus wasn't necessarily a first point guard. He was more of like a scoring guard, and so could Dennis Johnson, with obviously his defensive prowess. But on the offensive end, they could play interchangeably, which gave them a lot of versatility, and then just allowed them to really be able to play a lot of different ways. Open court, half court game with DJ's defensive prowess. They could be effective in that sort of game as well.
And in that finals in '79, the MVP ultimately went to Dennis Johnson, but Gus Williams was actually the leading scorer in the series, which I think goes to your point of the two of them, complementing each other, where one guy could be the MVP of the finals, but the other guy was the leading scorer because they each knew their roles and fed off each other really well.
Yeah. And on the sort of the note of something that nobody who doesn't listen to our podcasts would possibly care about, I kind of feel like Gus Williams got screwed here a little bit in the '79 NBA Finals race. He was I've always been, even though I'm a Knick fan, I've always been a great respecter of Dennis Johnson. So let's take nothing away from Dennis Johnson, but guy was the leading scorer for the Sonics in every single game. He was the leading scorer in the from either team in every game but the last one, when I think it was Elvin Hayes was the leading scorer in Game 5, but I don't know, maybe I didn't look at the assist numbers or whatever, but I don't know. It seems like maybe Gus Williams should have been the MVP of that series.
And as well, he should have. And I tell you what, I mean, you look at that Sonics team from that era, and what really put them over the top was that, in the offseason of '79, they brought in Lonnie Shelton to kind of like take the load off of an aging Paul Silas. And that really would have sent them over the top. And plus, I think that Gus was trying to have a little bit of revenge on the Bullets because the year before in Game 7, he had a horrible game. I think he went like 4 for 20 from the field in that Game 7. Dennis Johnson didn't score a single field goal in that Game 7, and the game was in Seattle. So that was kind of odd, that happened. But to your point, Dan, he should have been MVP. And I was surprised that looking at his stats while preparing for this, I was like, I always thought that Dennis Johnson was the leading scorer because he was, finals MVP, but it never occurred to me that Gus Williams was the leading scorer for pretty much the whole series, all 5 games.
Yeah, and then he ends up sitting out a year with the contract dispute, comes back. Perhaps his best season is in 81-82 when he comes back, wins comeback player of the year, and then actually gets traded to the Bullets and plays a couple seasons with them. He's it's like right before Moses gets to the Bullets in the late 80s. But he's on the team with Jeff Ruland and Manute Bol, and so in the playoffs a couple years, not a great Bullets team by any means, but a decent enough Bullets team. And then the only other factoid I thought was kind of cool that I found, and this isn't specifically about him, but the Seattle Sonics victory in the 1979 NBA Finals was the only world championship for the city of Seattle over about 100-year period. In 1917, the Seattle Americans won the Stanley Cup in the very early years of the NHL Stanley Cup. And then 2014, the Legion of Boom Seahawks won. So what's that? 97 years, and the only championship was that one Seattle Supersonics title.
That's a really good nugget, Dan. Really good.
One final tidbit about Gus, from my perspective, is also that, Dan, to your point, he should have been MVP, but it just went to show that he was always overlooked. And this is an interesting tidbit about him being overlooked as well. I think all the way until the ascension of Durant, Russell Westbrook, and left-hand guy James Harden in OKC, Gus had like the top 5 highest scoring performances in franchise history, because they didn't separate the records when they left Seattle to go to the Thunder. They carried the records over, which I think is a travesty, because they should, it's kind of similar to what the Ravens and Browns did. Those should be Seattle Supersonic records. So whenever the league expands, obviously Seattle is first on the list. They can pick up from there. And then OKC could be its own separate history as well. But for the longest time, until KD came around, he had like at least 4 of the 5 top all-time point performances in playoff games.
And I do think that whenever Seattle gets a team back, that they will reassume those Sonics records, but that obviously remains to be seen. Williams was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. It was an action shot, but he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated the week after the Sonics won the title. And there's also a famous picture of him with his uniform on, standing with the Seattle skyline behind him. And I also give him credit. He is, if you folks want to Google this picture, it's really easy. Just Google Gus Williams and it'll be one of the pictures that come up. It was only a few more years where NBA players would just be going bald. Nowadays, they just nowadays if you're going bald, you shave your head. And in the NBA, and really just I guess in America in general. But Gus Williams is an all-star NBA player whose hair looks like what he was, which was a man in his 30s losing his hair. So Charles, Dana, Chuck, Dana, it was a pleasure to have you guys on. We will hear from you all again later, and we'll also take the opportunity to hear a little bit about your podcast when we have you guys back on in a little bit.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Cool.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, we want to thank Dana and Chuck for kicking us off and talking about Gus Williams. They'll be back with us later on in the episode, and you're back with Andrew and me for a few in a row here, actually several in a row, and a lot of non-players or people who didn't make their name as a player coming up here. It's kind of an interesting list this year. But Andrew, I don't know if you will need to use the cough button while you do this, but why don't you introduce us to our next topic?
Sure, Dan. Bob Uecker, born in 1934, died on January 16th. A career backup catcher with 4 National League teams, Uecker worked as a broadcaster for the Milwaukee Brewers for 54 years and also did national broadcasts for ABC and NBC. Well known for his humor, he appeared frequently on late-night TV shows and starred in the sitcom Mr. Belvedere and the movie Major League.
So, I mean, there's a lot to Bob Uecker. There's the funny part of the guy, but then there's also the fact that he was a baseball lifer and was doing games and play-by-play, too. This is something interesting that I think you don't hear about anymore. Back in sort of the beginning of like the 50s, 60s, 70s, when ex-players, baseball players would go into broadcasting, they would do radio play-by-play. So Rizzuto, Bob Uecker, I'm sure there are others that I'm just not thinking of. I think Wade Hoyt was a play-by-play guy for the Reds in the 60s. It's not like today where you've got a guy who's a broadcaster and probably went to college for broadcasting and is, made his way up through, the minors and college hockey and whatever else. Guys did play-by-play who were former players, and Uecker he did his last Brewers game, I think, at the end of the 24 season in the playoffs play-by-play. So he did radio play-by-play for the Brewers almost until 90 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you think about not maybe the most high-profile part, but the vast majority of his career was as a Brewers broadcaster. That's what he was. And it's interesting. A guy I know, I worked with him for a year or two when I lived in Washington, D.C., actually. And he's from Milwaukee and he moved back to Wisconsin. And I haven't talked to him in years, but I'm friends with him on Facebook and he's a big Brewers fan. And he would post things about Uecker, like pretty much entirely in the context of him being being the Brewers announcer. And it's interesting because that's nationally, and from our perspective, there's a couple of things that we'll talk about that he's most known for. But, for a big portion of his life, that's what he did. And, the Brewers weren't a franchise that was perennially having great moments and winning a lot of championships or anything like that. But, he's in Milwaukee. Had he never done a Miller Lite commercial or been in a movie, he would have been a legend in Milwaukee just for his tenure and career with the Brewers.
Yeah, he was really, and he did a lot of baseball for a lot of years. He was with ABC and NBC in the 70s and 80s, and there's the famous thing of him doing a game. I don't know who the third broadcaster was, but one of them, I think it might have been Jim Palmer, but it was him and Howard Cosell and somebody else, and Uecker said something to Howard Cosell, and Cosell goes, "You don't have to be so truculent, Bob, if you even know what truculent means." And Uecker goes, "Well, of course I know what truculent means." And Cosell says, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, if you have a truck and I borrow it, that was a truculent." So just really like good and quick on his feet, didn't take himself too seriously. But he also was a really good color commentator. He did, in the 90s, he went back to NBC and he did a couple of World Series. He did the 95 and 97 World Series. He did a bunch of playoff and LCS games. Him and Joe Morgan and Uecker were the team for most of the 96 ALCS with the Yankees and the Orioles, including the Jeffrey Mayer game. And his commentary was really good and on point in that. And he could break into a joke, but it's not like when he was doing a game, even as a color commentator, it's not like he was constantly just doing his shtick. He had that other side of him that was a really serious baseball guy.
Yeah, and that's if you see clips of him doing Brewers games the last few years, and again, he's much older and he had a much lighter workload, but it's it's just him doing a baseball game, and you recognize the voice as Bob Uecker, but it's not, he's not Harry Doyle from Major League when he's doing baseball games.
But then again, at the other hand, he was a really funny guy. And I mean, I guess it started, in the 70s with, appearances on Johnny Carson and that type of thing. And it really, became its own thing. What was that?
I'm sure that's where the Mr. Baseball name came from, because that was Carson to a T. He used to call Darin. Like that was, I'm sure Carson's sort of dry sense of humor is the one who coined him Mr. Baseball. And, for years they would talk about stand-up comedians where if you went on Johnny Carson and had a good 5 minutes and he invited you over to the couch, you were a star. Well, Bob Uecker wasn't a stand-up comedian, but if he was, if you went on and were entertaining and funny and Carson liked you and had you back, you were a star. And, that's sort of what launched Bob Uecker. And then he was making Miller Lite commercials, and that brought him into a whole nother stratosphere, really.
And that was, the whole I must be in the front row thing. And he's sitting all the way in the top, the very highest row at what was it, Fulton County Stadium in Milwaukee.
County Stadium is in Atlanta.
Yeah. What was it though? Was it just County Stadium? He's sitting up there, and at their current park at Miller Park or whatever it's called now, American Family Field, there's actually 2 statues of Bob Uecker. There's one down on the, in front of the ballpark. And then there's one, which I have to say, we did not go visit this when we were there a couple years ago, but there's another statue of him all the way up in the highest row at what was once Miller Park.
Yeah. And I was looking for it when I was there this summer. And the thing I was convinced it was, then I realized it wasn't, because I saw people going up to something else and sitting in next to it. And I was like, oh, I think that's the Uecker thing. So sort of on the pop culture thing, we mentioned the Miller Lite commercials, and he gets really popular doing the Miller Lite commercials. And I think if we were a slightly different kind of podcast, there'd be an episode about, like, I don't think even us growing up, me less so, but like, those Miller Lite commercials in the 80s were like a legitimate cultural phenomenon.
And the number of guys that were in them, Dick Butkus and John Madden and Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura were in one of them. Like, you could make a list, and I'm sure I could find it somewhere, like Billy Martin and George Steinbrenner, and sometimes like 7 or 8 guys in one commercial. Earl Weaver. Tons of these guys were in these commercials. It was crazy.
And then he gets a role on Mr. Belvedere. He plays like just a cast member father on a popular network show, which is like very surprising. But the 2 things that I'm going to use a point of personal privilege here. First of all, he's in Major League, and he's in the second one too, but whatever. He's in Major League, which is still an all-time baseball movie. And he plays a sort of, not of himself, but he plays a guy who is a local play-by-play radio announcer for a bad team. And he's got some iconic lines in that movie. I mean, obviously he didn't write them, but just a bit outside. The one I love the most is he's trying to find out who's the post-game sponsor, and he just says, Christ, I can't find it. The hell with this. And I've always liked that. And then again, as a point of personal privilege, he is a special guest announcer personality at WrestleMania 3 and WrestleMania 4. And WrestleMania 3 specifically, if you're at all a wrestling history person, Hulk Hogan against Andre the Giant is still arguably the most important match in the history of professional wrestling, and he is the ring announcer. And he is also the perfect celebrity. He's clearly, brushed up on what's going on. He's funny. He plays off the guys well. There's a great legendary thing with him at WrestleMania 4 with Andre the Giant choking him. He's exactly what you would want in a role like that. I think it just shows you how malleable he was and natural, because he grew up as a baseball player and transitioned into this like showman in every regard for a long time.
Well, and there's this one scene with, I think when he's interviewing, I think it's Jimmy Hart and the Honky Tonk Man, and they're just like giving a Bob Uecker makes a joke, and Bobby and the Honky Tonk Man goes, "You want to talk about jokes? Let's talk about somebody's lifetime batting average." And as they leave, Uecker just goes, "You guys are never coming to my house."
Yep.
Yeah. And he played off the guys. He played off Bobby Heenan. He did sort of just a really good, and he also had a way. He did basically one episode. He basically was in the booth for one match in each at each WrestleMania, and he had a way of kind of making jokes that were a little bit dirty, but that maybe you wouldn't pick up on if you weren't completely thinking about it. But yeah, like you said, it really just kind of came naturally to him. As far as the major league thing is concerned, and I don't really have proof of this, but in a lot of ways it had to be kind of good luck, because I think the reason he ended up in the first major league was just that they happened to be filming it in Milwaukee.
Probably. Yeah, they filmed all the baseball scenes in that movie were filmed in Milwaukee. It's supposed to be Municipal Stadium in Cleveland, but it's County Stadium in Milwaukee is where a lot of that movie was filmed. And he obviously would have been in full swing as a Brewers announcer at the time. So, it's, for a guy who was born in the 30s and last played baseball in the early 60s, he had a lot of not influence, but like he was pervasive in my childhood for somebody born in 1986 who didn't live in Milwaukee. You know what I mean? And that's how sort of omnipresent he was at that point.
Just two other things that I want to mention about him, one on the field and one off. First of all, and I didn't look this up until the other day, but there was a myth out there that he hit Sandy Koufax really well. I looked that up. That is not true. His lifetime was 7 hits off of Koufax in 41 plate appearances. That is a 184 batting average. He had 2 doubles and 1 home run off of Koufax. That myth must have arisen from the fact that in 65, which was Koufax's second to last year, I think Koufax was even MVP that year. I'd have to. Koufax was NL MVP that year. Cy Young, Dodgers won the World Series. All-time great Koufax pitching season. That year, Uecker was 6 for 15, 400 batting average with a double and a home run as 2 of his 6 hits. So that had to be the reason for it, because if you look at the general Koufax versus Uecker stats, he didn't do much better against Koufax than anybody else did. He hit 184. And then I just have to mention, just because, it's out there and it just, I think it's hilarious, is some of the stories, some of the more R-rated stories that Norm Macdonald and Artie Lang would tell about him, and the stories he would tell, and just his use of the cough button, and how he would say things like, there's a ground ball to short, and then he would hit the cough button and say something filthy, and then he would, put the button back on and say, oh, it's over to first, 1 out. So the fact of the matter was that he was also just a hilariously filthy guy in his private life.
Yeah, no, he seems like he'd be a great time if you had an evening with him having drinks and listening to him talk. It sounds like that'd be a pretty memorable night.
And what did he do that time? he heard Artie Lang do a story about him on Conan, and or whatever it was, Leno or whatever it was, and he called Norm Macdonald and said, "What's going on with that effing Artie Klein? He must be a little short on material." So, look it up. Just look up Norm Macdonald, Artie Lang, Bob Uecker, and it's them on the Howard Stern show telling stories about Norm Macdonald, and it's you will not be telling stories about Bob Uecker. You will not be disappointed.
Exactly.
All right. Well, why don't we move on to somebody else who maybe was not quite as hilarious, but nonetheless deserves to be commemorated, and that is Fay Vincent, who was born in 1938 and passed away on February 1st. Vincent served as the 8th commissioner of Major League Baseball from 1989 to 1992. During this time, he oversaw the lifetime suspension of George Steinbrenner and the addition of 2 new expansion teams in Florida and Colorado. He resigned in 1992 after receiving a vote of no confidence from MLB owners.
Which I didn't really know was a thing they did, but, okay, it's like a prime minister thing, but I did not know that till we learned about him today. So, a relatively short tenure when you look at it, but some significant things. He, the 89 World Series, having to navigate that with the earthquake in the middle of the series, one of the Steinbrenner suspensions, and then the 93, he was gone by the time this took effect, but shepherding the expansion to Florida and Colorado, the second to most recent baseball expansion, with the Rockies and the Marlins becoming a team. And the other question I had here for you is he the last commissioner in any sport? I guess you'd have to expand it beyond baseball because there's only been a couple of commissioners since him. Is he the last commissioner in the major North American professional sports that wasn't entirely just an extension of the owner's interests?
Yes. Yeah. He was, and I think that is the that was what ended up. I mean, I guess you could maybe make a case for David Stern, because Stern was just so he was so sort of, above it all in some ways. And I guess to a certain degree, you could say that Adam Silver, I don't know, maybe he's not a tool of the owners, but he's also very sensitive to the players' concerns about a lot of things. But as far as a guy who sees himself as sort of the neutral arbiter of what's right in the sport, you're right. It's definitely been in a major decline since Vincent. Fay Vincent, during the 1990 MLB lockout, and this was very soon after he became the commissioner, went to the players' union with his own proposal for how the lockout should end. Went outside the owners, and I think things were probably never the same after that, but he was that kind of guy. He was a guy who would go against the owners to the players in a labor negotiation if he thought it was the best thing for the league and for the sport.
Yeah, he seems to be a guy who was at least somewhat interested in what the fair outcome of a thing was. His quote on collusion I thought was interesting. Less so the quote, I'll give the quote in a minute, but more just the fact that he even conceded, yes, I can see this from the player's point of view. You would never see Roger Goodell or Rob Manfred say that, but he said, the quote Vincent had on the effects of collusion said, the union basically doesn't trust the ownership because collusion was a $280 million theft by Selig and Reinsdorf of that money from the players. I mean, they rigged the signing of free agents. They got caught. They paid $280 million to the players. And I think that's polluted labor relations in baseball ever since it happened. I think it's the reason Fair has no trust in Selig.
The other piece of it, though, was that he could be a little bit imperious. There's a story after Steve Howe was banned from baseball, one of his many bans, probably, I think it was Showalter's first year as Yankee manager in 1992. And Buck Showalter had made a comment in the press that he thought that a lifetime ban for Steve Howe was excessive. And he was called to the commissioner's office. He and I think another Yankee official were called to the commissioner's office by Vincent. And Vincent told Buck Showalter, he said, "You're an employee of Major League Baseball. By speaking out in opposition to the commissioner's office and its discipline of Steve Howe, you have effectively resigned from Major League Baseball." So basically saying that you're fired. You're not Yankee manager anymore because you expressed an opinion on the Steve Howe lifetime drug suspension. So the sort of flip side of his sort of best interests of baseball was that it caused him, kind of like a David Stern could do at times, it kind of caused him to overstep and do things like threaten Buck Showalter with a ban from baseball for speaking out against Steve Howe's suspension.
So he's not long for it. Eventually, a power play orchestrated by Bud Selig and what they call the Great Lakes Gang. A lot of the owners from the teams in the middle of the country,
small market teams.
The small market teams. It says the leaders of the movement to oust Vincent were members of what the Sporting News later dubbed the Great Lakes Gang. Bud Selig, president of the Milwaukee Brewers; Gerry Reinsdorf, chairman of the Chicago White Sox; Stanton Cook, head of the Tribune Co., which owned the Cubs; Carl Pollard, owner of the Twins; Peter O'Malley, longtime majority owner of the Dodgers; and then William Bartholomew, longtime part owner and chairman of the Atlanta Braves. Vincent's farewell, he said, "To do the job without angering an owner is impossible. I can't make all 28 of my bosses happy. People have told me I'm the last commissioner. If so, it's a sad thing. I hope the owners learn this lesson before too much damage is done."
Yeah, and I should also clarify that on this Showalter thing, it was actually, I think, in some sort of a hearing where Showalter made this statement, and Vincent still threatened him. So it's almost even worse, threatening him for just giving testimony in a hearing. To your point, I think that the owners of those small market teams probably knew what was coming with all the labor dispute in the mid-90s, so they probably wanted to get one of their own guys in there, and that was what Bud Selig ended up being. Sort of an interesting footnote to that is that one of the guys who's reluctant to vote yes in this vote of no confidence against Vincent is George W. Bush, who I think the Bush family and the Vincent family had a relationship. And in fact, Bush himself wants to be commissioner after Vincent is ousted. But yeah, he only lasts 3 years. After his basically forced resignation, he actually goes on to write a bunch of oral history books where he interviews great players from basically the 40s through the 80s about their experiences in Major League Baseball. So the guy loved the sport and the game and the history of baseball. He just was not a commissioner who was maybe very well equipped to be commissioner of the sport in a changing sports landscape.
Yeah, it didn't seem like he really had enough friends in the places he needed. And obviously Bud Selig had eyes on that job because he orchestrated this ouster, and a couple of years later would find himself as the owner. So that's probably not a coincidence. And he held that job for decades after that.
So we're going to now kind of go back into the media for a couple of segments, and maybe Andrew will introduce our next person.
Al Trautwig, born 1956, passed away on February 23rd. A lifelong New Yorker, Trautwig worked as a host and sideline reporter for Yankee, Ranger, and Knick games for the MSG network. At various times, he also covered the Olympics, Tour de France, and Indianapolis 500.
This is not necessarily one we're going to spend a ton of time on, but looking back at the formative years of my childhood watching sports, and Al Trautwig, the MSG network was kind of the center of the teams that we followed growing up. Not a big hockey fan, but the Rangers, but then the Yankees were on MSG network throughout the 80s and 90s. The Knicks obviously were on MSG network throughout the 1990s, and it seems like Al Trautwig was just sort of there for all of it. He was a substitute on Knicks play-by-play games, basically from 1989 until the Carmelo years. He was a backup Yankee play-by-play guy throughout the 90s, 90 to 2001. He was I think he was the sideline reporter for the 94 Rangers. And this was in the 90s, the Stanley Cup playoffs. I think they were on ESPN maybe, but it was not an exclusive deal. So when the Rangers won the Cup in 94, that game was broadcast on the MSG network, and Trautwig was, I believe he was the sideline or the locker room reporter for that game. He emceed the 94 Rangers parade. So during a time when Madison Square Garden and the MSG network were sort of the epicenter of New York sports, Al Trautwig was there for quite a bit of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Carmelo thing, and that's obviously most of what I would talk about and remember is earlier, and there's a couple of things specific I want to get into, but the night the Knicks, Carmelo's first game with the Knicks against the Bucks after they made that big trade, you can still find the MSG network intro at the beginning of the broadcast, and it's Al Trautwig doing the voiceover, and he's like, "Did you think it could happen? Well, it did. New York has its second big star, and now Madison's." It's like, but it's Al Trautwig in 2013 or 2012 or whatever that year was. I guess it was 11 or something. But yeah, it's almost like the way, and again, not to invoke wrestling again, but it's like a lot of my fondest memories as a kid with wrestling. A lot of the guys I remember warmest aren't always the wrestlers. It's sort of the ancillary guys, the commentators and the announcers and stuff, and the interviewers. And Al Trautwig was one of those guys with MSG. Like, MSG was the local sports channel. There was no Yes. There was no SNY. I guess there was Sports Channel, but to me, MSG was like the local sports channel. We didn't even get sports channel. Yeah. Growing up. Yeah. He was always there, and he would do, like, I remember, within the last 10, 15 years, him doing pre-games for the Knicks and the Nets, or not the Nets, the Knicks and the Rangers, and sitting by the, in the upper balcony of the Garden, and you could see it. The thing I remember most about Al Trautwig is the videos, the end of the year Yankee yearbooks when they would win the World Series. And we had a few of them, specifically the 96 one, but he's the host of the 96 one, and he's the he does the stuff at the beginning, and he's the narrator of it. And a lot of cities have guys like this, but he also did a few national things. He was in the movie Cool Runnings too, which was a big movie for kids in our generation. He did a lot of Olympics, and he particularly did a lot of Winter Olympics stuff. He absolutely did. So, yeah, but so a guy who, he did some national stuff, but to me, more New York specifically, and MSG network. And at the time, it's weird to think of now, but the Yankees were as intertwined with MSG network as the Knicks and the Rangers were then. So he kind of did it all when I was coming of age and you were coming of age as a New York sports fan. Yeah, and this is maybe not specifically about him, but I would just kind of want to mention, you talked about Sports Channel, which was the channel that the New Jersey Nets were on, because I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, I was really into the Knicks as a little kid and was watching every Knick game. And one night they played the Nets, and it was on Sports Channel. And I remember being all upset and going to our father being like, "Where's the game? Like, why can't I watch the game?" And it was like the one Knick Net game that was on Sports Channel rather than MSG Network. And I guess,
it's sort of like we've talked about in the past and touched on in the past with WFAN and Mike and the Mad Dog. And the 90s were such a golden time period in New York sports. You know, the Giants at the beginning of the decade, and then Knicks and Rangers, Yankees getting better, you know, all these things. You know, the Jets were not usually very good, but they had a lot of drama. And especially in the pre-internet days, for a kid who's trying to keep his finger on the pulse of New York sports, just watching MSG Network, and they had this half-hour show called Sports Desk, and that would be usually what they would do at halftime. They would Sports Desk at the half, and it was I'm blanking on the guy's name who hosted Sports Desk forever, but it was, you know, another one of these anchors, and you know, and I'm seeing here that Trautwig hosted a Jets show on MSG Network from the 80s until like 2004, and so MSG Network was such a key to being a sports fan in New York in the 80s and 90s that it's really kind of hard to explain if you're not somebody who's familiar with it. But anybody who's listening to this who is familiar with it will know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of cities have that. It's just a different, you know, I know in Philly for years it was Prism, but, you know, Nesson and all those. But for us, it was MSG, and it's our show, so we're going to talk about Al Trautwig.
We are, and we did. And so he was a key part of the New York sports landscape for a lot of years. And now we're going to talk about somebody who was a key part of the DC sports landscape, although also somebody who ended up with quite a bit of national prominence as well, and that is John Feinstein, who was born in 1955 and died on March 13th. A longtime sports reporter and columnist for the Washington Post, Feinstein wrote dozens of best-selling sports books. While he wrote about many sports, he is best remembered for his writing on college basketball. His best-known work was A Season on the Brink, which provided previously unknown details about Bobby Knight and his Indiana program. Maybe one of the best sports books of all time, A Season on the Brink. I've read it. It's basically Feinstein was embedded with Bobby Knight's Indiana team for an entire season in the 1980s. And I don't think anybody was under any illusion that Bob Knight was John Wooden in temperament, but a lot of the behind-the-scenes things that Feinstein wrote about contributed to a greater understanding of just how volatile Bobby Knight and his temper were.
Yeah, and that's still, you know, that's still one of the ones that's referenced on like anybody's short list of like great sports writing. And that's not an easy subject to cover then, now, anytime, because you have to walk the line between making it a hit piece and killing the guy, or lionizing him as just a competitor, and, you know, he just wants to win and all of that. And especially when you're getting that kind of access, that's the temptation. But, you know, the actual truth of the matter lies in the middle. And I think that's what made it such a compelling book that's kind of endured all these years later.
The NCAA did not like it. In fact, they banned embedded reporters after that season. It was funny. Feinstein kind of got the wrong season because he was there in 85, 86. If he'd been there a year later in 86, 87, that was when Indiana won the NCAA tournament and were national champions. And it's funny for me, actually, because I read the book, I don't know, 2006, 2007, whenever it was that I read it. It kind of weirdly had the opposite effect for me, because I had just known Bobby Knight as the crazy man and the guy who threw the chair, although that was previously, obviously. But, you know, I knew him as the guy who got fired from Indiana for choking a student, not even a player, just a student, you know, whether he actually choked him or not. But that was the narrative right around Bobby Knight. And I remember being impressed by the humanization of Bobby Knight, his emphasis on academics, his viewing himself as a teacher. One of the lines that always sticks out to me from the book is he used to say to his team all the time, basketball should be your favorite class. And so he very much kind of viewed himself that way. So in a weird way, it kind of did the opposite for me as somebody reading it 20 years after the fact. It kind of humanized the good parts of Bobby Knight a little bit.
It's really interesting and it's kind of timely because of when we're recording this. But when I got season tickets to Army football going into the 2017 season, and I, would go to the website, and at least through 2020, I couldn't find any. I just did a quick search and I couldn't find anything since then, but maybe it was. He would just write a weekly article on the Army football website, just about the game the week before, about the game the week coming up. Like it was called Feinstein's Findings. I just found a few of the articles from the 2020 season. And it wasn't like, it was just like a normal, like you'd see somebody who writes for a college's website write an article, except it's like one of the most famous guys, for 30 years in the profession. But I think just at that point, he obviously wasn't doing that to make money or get famous. I think he just wanted to write about the Army Eastern Michigan game from that week, which is refreshing because some sports writers, when they get to a point where they've written books, they're opinion havers, and the actual games start to act like the actual games are beneath them, and they're only there to cover issues and palace intrigue and scandals. And it was kind of refreshing to see a guy who's just like, yeah, that's important, but also like, I want to talk about Army's third down defense. You know what I mean?
Well, and the other thing too about him is, college basketball was his first love, and then he also run a ton of golf. And I'm a sports fan. I'll read anything, but I had very little interest in golf. And I don't know that I would ever read one of his golf books. But the thing about him was he was always sort of looking for new books, new topics to cover, and so he didn't really do any hockey writing, but he did an NBA book. He did some NFL books. He did a book about the Rudy Tomjanovich Kermit Washington punch fight that hurt Tomjanovich so badly. A book was called The Punch. He did a book. He did two baseball books. He did one in and I haven't actually read either of these books, but I hope to one day. The book he did in the early 90s about Major League Baseball, and it's called Play Ball, and it's about the 1992 Major League Baseball season, which, if you think about it, is kind of a very interesting time in baseball because it's pre-steroids, it's pre-strike, it's pre a lot of these things. And it's about, Barry Bonds signing with Pittsburgh and all these things. It's kind of an interesting look at a very sort of interesting time in baseball history. And then in 2006, he did another really good book, which is another really interesting idea. It's called A Season on the Black, or Living on the Black. And it's about, he follows around Tom Glavine and Mike Mussina for a whole season, two veteran pitchers playing on really good Met and Yankee teams, respectively. So even though college basketball was sort of his first love and golf was his second, he was a guy who could suddenly write an NFL book, write a baseball book, write an NBA book, and I really respected that with him.
Yeah. So, like you said, sort of a guy who probably could have specialized and, probably could have become, well, I just in bed with with different high profile coaches and write these articles and, never seemed to really stop, I guess, challenging himself about what to write about from a sports standpoint.
Well, why don't we move on? And we are going to return to sort of on field, or I guess in this case, in ring performers. And Andrew, why don't you tell us who's next?
Sure. George Foreman, born in 1949, passed away on March 21st. Foreman won the gold medal in heavyweight boxing at the 1968 Olympics before beginning a professional career. He died his defeat of an undefeated Joe Frazier in 1973 is one of the most famous moments in boxing history. Foreman returned to the ring in 1987 after a 10-year retirement and shockingly won the heavyweight title in 1994 at the age of 45.
So there's kind of two George Foremans, right? We did an episode that was one of our very first episodes, but it was actually one of my favorite episodes also that we ever did, which was the story of the heavyweight boxing, a history of the heavyweight boxing champion from John L. Sullivan, basically all the way up to the present day. And we got into a lot of things over those two episodes. And, the sort of scowling young George Foreman who shocks the world by knocking out Joe Frazier is a very different man in many ways than the tubby, bald, kind of happy guy with the grill who wins this crazy world championship in 1994, 1995.
Yeah, so we should almost take it as two pieces. And another guy who was sort of pervasive in our childhoods, and it was the tubby, bald version of him by then, doing Meineke commercials, I believe it was, and was very famous at the time for all of his kids being named George, all of his male children being named George. But before that, he was seen as like a killer in the ring. He came up, he won that Olympic gold medal in 1968 and stepped into a heavyweight division that was, it was Muhammad Ali and it was Joe Frazier, and he turned pro in June of 1969 and won his first, many fights. And we talked about we sort of mentioned the Joe Frazier fight in 1973, which is one of the most famous quotes of all time. That's the down goes Frazier fight, where he just continually knocks him down. It's funny, I just turned to the page of my notes and I literally had written, when I did this studying, two different George Foremans, and then you made the exact same thing. So he knocks out Joe Frazier and fights in Jamaica. He knocks Frazier down 6 times and knocks him out and wins the heavyweight title. And when we talk about the Ali Frazier trilogy, and we talk about how the second one wasn't for a championship, that was because Joe Frazier had lost his championship to Muhammad Ali, or to George Foreman in 1973.
And it's important to note that this was before Ali beats Frazier twice. So I don't know, was Frazier undefeated going into that fight, or maybe he'd lost early on, but Frazier was seen as virtually unbeatable at that point when Foreman shocks him.
Yep, that was his first loss. Frazier lost 4 times. He lost to Ali twice and he lost to Foreman twice. So he wins that fight, and then he has a couple of title defenses and goes to Kinshasa, Zaire in 1974, October of 74, for the Rumble in the Jungle. And this is also one of the most famous boxing matches of all time against Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali and his, been back in boxing for 3 or 4 years, is seen as being a little bit past the past his prime, so to speak. And the thought is, well, how can Ali, stand and punch with this guy? And Ali employs a strategy called rope-a-dope, where he basically lets Foreman tire himself out punching him, which worked and was a brilliant strategy, but was also incredibly risky to do such a thing, because you're letting a guy like George Foreman punch you a bunch of times, and obviously he's trying to block him and stuff, but like, you could get knocked out before your strategy pays dividends.
He's not going on offense, basically.
Yeah. So he ends up winning, Ali ends up winning the fight. Foreman has a couple more fights. He fights Frazier again in June of 76. And after he loses to a guy named Jimmy Young in March of 1977, retires from boxing. And this is sort of the end of what we know as George Foreman 1. And he retires from boxing. He had gotten, in that fight against Young, he'd gotten heat stroke. He later called it a near-death experience. He becomes a born again Christian. He starts, preaching and is like a street preacher at first, and then he's gets involved in sort of like televangelism and things like that. And then in 1987, he decides he's 38 years old. He decides that he's going to come back to boxing. There's some theories that maybe some of it is that he needed money, but comes back, maybe with an eye on ultimately fighting Mike Tyson, which never really materializes. Fights pretty steadily for a number of years, but not really against big names until April of 1991 when he fights and loses to Evander Holyfield, who's, I'm believing, the heavyweight champion at the time. Again, at this point, he starts to become a figure that is seen with the Meineke commercials, and I was saying, with all of his sons being named George and that kind of stuff, and has a couple more fights, and ultimately in 1994, at 45 years old, ends up fighting the guy who was a heavyweight champion at the time, Michael Moore.
So I just want to touch on a few quick things, sort of random pieces of, I don't know if trivia is the right word, but just things to know about George Foreman. He actually gets his start boxing in something called the Job Corps, which was part of the Great Society. It was a initiative of the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, and it was a way to for poor young men, and I would imagine for especially poor young black men, to go somewhere and learn a trade, learn how to get a job, that type of thing. George Foreman gets in so many fights in his Job Corps when he's in the Job Corps that one of the counselors there, one of the teachers, suggests that he becomes a boxer, and so that's what gets him started in his boxing career. He is so thankful for the Job Corps that he actually ends up donating one of his championship belts to the LBJ Library in Texas, which I thought was interesting.
But I think the B in LBJ stood for boxing, so it makes sense.
I might have been Baines.
No, I don't know if it was Harold Baines's nickname. Middle.
Good Lord. Good Lord. The other thing is that, again, sort of on the sort of the Black history front, and this is from a book by Freddie Pacheco, who's a famous fight doctor, and I've referenced this book before. It's called It's about the 12 greatest rounds of boxing. Talking about the Rumble in the Jungle, he says it's the first heavyweight championship fight that has a black champion, which is Foreman, a black challenger, Ali, a black promoter, Don King, a black referee, a guy by the name of Zach Clayton, and an all-black host country, which is Zaire. So a sort of an interesting footnote in black history there, that Ali Foreman fight in Zaire. He was trained by Archie Moore, at least for a time, who was a former heavyweight champion of his own right in the 1950s. Is he the guy who Marciano fought in his last fight?
Yeah, I knew we talked about Archie Moore recently, so yes.
Yeah, he was the guy. So Moore was mostly not a former heavyweight champion. He was the light heavyweight champion, but who goes up a weight class to fight against Marciano in Marciano's last ever fight. And then the other thing, I think, just going way back, is that even before he turns pro, Foreman is very well known for winning the gold medal in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. And, I know I keep sort of mentioning sort of the history of, the black history element of that, but I think it's sort of such a key part of that time in the 1960s. A lot of black athletes had sort of taken more of a protest path, whether it was the two sprinters, Smith and Carlos, with the black power signal on the medal stand after winning, after the 400 meters, I think, in the 68 Olympics, and then guys like Kareem, who refused to go to the Olympics. Foreman kind of is sort of not caught up in that. In fact, his most famous moment is waving a tiny American flag after winning the gold medal in one of the boxing events in 1968. So even before sort of the two acts of his career and life as a heavyweight, as a professional, he's well known for one of the most famous moments of the 68 Olympics too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he took a little heat for that, like you said, within the context of of boxing, especially all of life and all of sports in 1968 being, of race and racism and political, civil rights. But it's not like he then became some sort of there was always the argument that Frazier, and I mean, a lot of this was Ali, but like that Frazier was like the white man's champion. There really wasn't any of that with Foreman. If anything, he had less of he was, it was the George Foreman 2 that we're talking about, where he was seen as like I don't think this was accurate, but he was seen as the big cuddly, teddy bear type guy.
Well, two things. First of all, I never got the impression, and I'm not a huge expert on it, but I never got the impression that Foreman's sort of anger, in the 70s was based on race or politics. He just seemed like he was just kind of a grumpy, angry, hard scrabble guy. I don't know that there was a lot, unlike with an Ali maybe or somebody. It doesn't seem like there was much meaning behind Foreman's anger of the 70s, other than just being a very surly kind of, that was his personality. As far as the 90s and the cuddly thing, whether it was true or not, I think you have to acknowledge that it was an image that he cultivated. So if he was perceived inaccurately, he probably bears at least some of the responsibility for that. It's kind of like Yogi Berra, who kind of marketed himself a certain way. I think it's kind of the same thing for Foreman. He played up those aspects of his personality in his second go-round.
Foreman also became a commentator for HBO Boxing, particularly. He was usually with Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant. He was okay. He had his detractors, he had his backers, but with those two guys who were so synonymous with boxing. But really, the biggest thing when we're in the context of sports was in 1994. He's fighting Michael Moore, who's got a heavyweight title. We're in the era by then of fractured heavyweight championships. Foreman is 45 years old. He's big. And he basically is gonna, similar to what happened in against him in Kinshasa, he's gonna kind of he's gonna stand there basically, and more, not so much let Moore tire himself out, but wait for his opening and try to make it count. And it worked. Moore is up comfortably in the scorecards as it gets later in the fight, and Moore's trainer is telling him, don't go right at this guy. You don't have to. You're ahead on points, and also he's not going to catch you. Basically, don't stand there and punch with him. Foreman lands a combination that rings Moore's bell a little bit, and then Foreman gets him. He gets him with the punch right on the jaw, and Moore falls backwards and is not able to beat the count. So he's still on his knees when the count reaches 10. And George Foreman, at 45 years old, and not in much shape at all, and bald as a cue ball, wins the heavyweight championship at 45. He's actually 5 days shy of his 46th birthday. 8 years older than Jersey Joe Walcott, who had previously had the record.
Yeah, and this is during such a weird time for boxing. I mean, the last 30 years have all been a weird time for boxing. It's, it's never clear whether he's, I guess I've seen some lists that consider him sort of the quote unquote lineal champion for those couple of years, but he had a title and then he vacated one and then he won another one. It was all, it gets convoluted when you're talking about boxing titles over the last 30 years, but he was, in some way, shape, or form, he was definitely heavyweight champion at his age for a little while in the mid 90s.
And then the last thing we should talk about with him is he had lost a lot of weight later on in his life, like later on in the 90s and maybe into the early 2000s. I don't remember the exact year, but he had talked about a lot of the reason he lost money was because of or lost weight was because of clean eating, and a company that was marketing a grill that was, they were going to market, as being healthier, approached him, and he agreed to be the namesake for the George Foreman grill, which in 1999 they paid him $138 million for the right to use his name. Before that, he got about 40% of the profits from each grill sold. So he became a very rich man by the virtue of probably the greatest product endorsement of all time in terms of marketing.
Yeah, I think probably the greatest product endorsement marketing that didn't involve Michael Jordan, but yeah. And I mean, also a product that people weren't going to buy anyway, right? Like Michael Jordan got in front of sneakers, but people were going to buy basketball sneakers regardless. People probably weren't going to buy a bunch of these little grills in the same way if George Foreman hadn't put his name on it and caught lightning in a bottle.
Well, and I guess the one thing I would say is if you show people a pair of Air Jordans, just normal people, and say, what are these? People will say sneakers. If you show them a George Foreman grill, they're going to say that's a George Foreman grill.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, I'm sure Michael Jordan made a lot more money and is still making that money, but I just mean in terms of the actual being synonymous with the thing itself.
All right, we are moving right along here, and we're going to be welcoming in another guest to talk about our next individual. But Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about who it is first?
Sure, Dan. Steve McMichael, born in 1957, died on April 23rd. McMichael played 1 year as a defensive tackle with the New England Patriots before landing in Chicago. While with the Bears, he was part of Buddy Ryan's famed 46 defense, featuring fellow Hall of Famers Richard Dent, Mike Singletary, and Dan Hampton. He won Super Bowl 20 with the Bears and was named an All-Pro 4 times.
And we are glad to have back with us a gentleman who's done this with us in previous years as well, Bob Swick, who is the editor of the Gridiron Greats magazine and also the co-host on the Sports History Network of the Gridiron Greats magazine podcast. So, Bob, good to see you again, and thanks for doing this with us again this year.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Steve McMichael, obviously, the end of his life was very sad, diagnosed with ALS and was inducted into the Hall of Fame just last year in 2024, prior to passing away. So, and I think the fourth member of that Bears defense from 85 to be inducted. So, what is it that stands out to you about Steve McMichael, his life, his football career?
Well, it's interesting as a backup to the Hall of Fame ceremony. Gridiron Greats magazine director of art and illustration Jared Krause was in contact with the family, and he actually went to his Hall of Fame ceremony as guest of the McMichael family, and it was a very, very moving experience for Jared. He did a beautiful bust of McMichael that we had on our front cover several issues ago when he went into the Hall of Fame. He did a nice menagerie of his life, and he gave it out at the ceremony. It was cool. It was very moving, to say the least. McMichael, to me, represented what the Bears were in the 80s, a powerhouse defensive team, a Buddy Ryan-orientated team that took no prisoners. They just went out, they played the game, they played it hard, they played it rough, and they played to win. And I just never could understand why the Patriots let him go. They didn't see the what he had in him in that first season, so they cut him, and the Bears picked him up, and the rest is basically history.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny because the pinnacle of his career and of that whole defense ended up beating up on the Patriots in the 1985 season in Super Bowl 20. So you wonder if there was a special measure of revenge there for him. And I guess the thing that really stood out for me about Steve McMichael, really two things. First of all, just his durability. He played 191 consecutive non-strike games, and obviously there were in '87 there were those games with the replacement players. But if you take those out of it, incredibly durable. Played 191 consecutive games, and in his later years, before he was diagnosed and started to show symptoms with ALS, really sort of a champion of those 85 Bear players and teams. In every 30 for 30 or documentary that you would see, he was one of the guys who was always out there front and center talking about how great the team was, how great the defense was, how great his teammates were, how great Buddy Ryan was. And so he, like you said, he really sort of personifies those 85 Bears more than really maybe anybody else. Tough, rough.
I think with the 85 Bears, and I think with the Bears of that decade, they all had chips on their shoulders to a certain degree. They all said to themselves, hey, we've been through the mill back. We want to prove to everybody we are champions. We are good defensive players. We are going to win, so on and so forth. And in my opinion, they really, put everything they could possibly put into the Super Bowl. And in doing so, they proved without a doubt and without a hesitation, the Patriots were not in that game from the initial kickoff. I mean, basically, that was probably one of the most lopsided Super Bowls I have ever watched. And I basically have watched every Super Bowl since the first one. So they had something to prove, and they proved it. Think about this. McMichael had 95 sacks, which is incredible for a career. And to put up, have that physical push to get out there every game, all the numbers of games, the 95 sacks. I mean, he was really a great player. And I think sadly he was too overlooked over the years. And that Hall of Fame ceremony is basically, hey, I think we made a mistake. We got to get him into the Hall of Fame. Sadly, came way too late in his career.
And the sack numbers are particularly impressive when you factor in the fact that he was playing defensive tackle, which even in the 46 defense is not a position that you expect to get a lot of sacks out of, especially when you factor in that he's playing next to two Hall of Fame defensive ends in Dan Hampton and Richard Dent. So it's even all the more impressive when you factor all of that into account.
Exactly. And again, add that to 17 fumbles that he recovered. He really played that position literally to a T and with little mistakes whatsoever. And again, I point out again, why did it take so long for him to get into the Hall of Fame? Is it that classic Hall of Fame prejudice against, well, we got too many guys from one team, like the Packers of the 60s, so on and so forth, so we can't get him in. And then you got to push to get the guy in at the end of his life. It doesn't make sense sometimes. But getting back to the field, he gave 110% on that field every game. His players knew they had his support. He watched everybody on that defense. They played like a unit. And again, to me, that Bears team was probably one of the best defensive teams in NFL history. And I think a lot of people will say the same thing.
And that 85 Bears team, 40 years on, it's such a phenomenon because you hear people, you talk about the 60s Packers, you talk about the 70s Steelers, the Steel Curtain. It's the 85 Bears. Obviously they had good defenses every other year, but that team has reached almost mythical proportions for a single season team. And I don't mean mythical like it's not true. I just mean it's like you'll hear coaches now, 40 years later, say to their teams like, oh, is that the 85 Bears out there? We can't make a block. It's, I don't know if it's just such a, it's on such a plateau, I guess I'm trying to say, compared to any other team single season.
And I also believe Buddy Ryan, who I believe very strongly was always a much better defensive coordinator than he was a head coach. because he understood defense. He understood what was necessary to put out 11 of the best defensive men he had there and to play the game the way they should play and follow what he was calling as he saw it on the sideline as far as movements, so on and so forth, checks, changes, matches, so on and so forth. And Buddy Ryan had a brilliant defensive mind. And to me, he was always one of the best, if not the best, defensive coordinator coach that was out there. And again, he kind of lost his flavor when he became a head coach. But again, we're looking at McMichael. We're looking at that team. They were to me a premier number one defensive team of the 80s. And they held, and like you said, they held no prisoners whatsoever. They went out, they wanted to win. That's it. Simple.
And McMichael certainly didn't experience any, significant drop off after Buddy Ryan left. So it's not like he was, just a product of of Buddy Ryan specifically. His
right.
88 was the year he had the most sacks, 11 and a half.
Yep.
And I thought this was interesting. His second highest sack output was in 1992 when he was 35 years old. And it's by 1992, the Bears are a much different team. Ditka's still there, but most of those guys are gone by then, and he's still playing at a very high level that many years later.
And think about this. He ended up still playing his last season with the Packers back in 94. So the Packers were in their prime, at that time also. And he had enough steam left to go for another season with the Packers and actually put out for the Packers and be a contributing factor in their defense at the same time. That's amazing.
He does have a good quote about that year. He says, "For 13 years, I helped the Bears beat the Packers every year. I whooped their ass, right? So last year I went up there and my leg wasn't any good anymore. So I stole their money and whipped their ass again." So,
Yeah.
I mean, he's still a decent enough year, but...
Well, definitely a one-of-a-kind personality on a one-of-a-kind defense. And Bob, we want to thank you for coming on and joining us to talk about Steve McMichael for a couple of minutes. You'll hear Bob again later on this, I guess probably actually in the next episode, talking about Kenny Easley. But why don't we, before we move on, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about the magazine that you run, the work you do on that, the work you do on your podcast for the Sports History Network. Just tell us a little bit about Gridiron Greats and all its different permutations.
Gridiron Greats magazine, we publish quarterly, 4 times a year. We write about football history and memorabilia of the game. We're on our 91st issue, which is going to be coming out in the end of December, beginning of January. We focus on history and memorabilia of football, and our podcast is an extension of the magazine. We talk to collectors one-on-one. We view their collections. We talk to football authors at the same time, talking about their books. And we try to give a little more in-depth, impersonal view on our podcast. And we try to do two podcasts a month throughout the course of the year.
And you can find out more just at gridirongreatsmagazine.com, correct?
Correct.
Well, we always appreciate you coming on, and we look forward to speaking to you again in a little bit about Kenny Easley.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Well, why don't we move on and talk about back to the world of team sports, which we hadn't been till I don't think, other than Uecker, I don't think we'd been on a team sport athlete all episode, at least not with Andrew and me. You just heard from Bob on Steve McMichael, but as far as just Andrew and me, I think we hadn't been back in team sports. But anyway, we're going to talk about Dick Barnett, who was born in 1936 and died on April 27th. A 2024 inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Barnett won 2 NBA titles with the New York Knicks in the 1970s and was named an All-Star in 1968. His number 12 was retired by the Knicks in 1990. Barnett, who he really was kind of all over the place. He played in the ABL with I don't forget which team. I can look that up in a second. But he was the last starter on the 70 Knicks that was not in the Hall of Fame. The 73 Knicks had 6 former future Hall of Famers on the roster: Reed, Bradley, DeBusschere, Frazier, Monroe, Jerry Lucas off the bench, not to mention Phil Jackson, who was obviously inducted later as a coach. And so Barnett was sort of the one guy who was a key player on those teams who hadn't been in the Hall of Fame. Finally got in 24. He's definitely not the player that some of these other guys were, but a key member of those Knicks teams, particularly in 70. By 73, he's almost kind of the fourth guard. It's, Frazier, Monroe, and even Dean Meminger there, but wins 2 titles with the team and ends up in the Hall of Fame many, many years later.
We talked about him recently when he was with the Lakers much earlier in his career in our random team episode.
Yep.
There's been 6 guys ever who've been starters on Knicks championship teams. Because 4 of them were the same in 70 and 73. And yeah, as a player, he's number 6 on that list, but that's still a pretty good list. And, for as a franchise, as the Knicks franchise, that puts him in rare air. He was a starting player on their first and only one of 2 championship teams, and was a damn good player in his own right. He wasn't Willis Reed, he wasn't Clyde Frazier, wasn't Bill Bradley, but he was a key member of the championship team. Actually.
Really an interesting career. He starts off with the old Syracuse Nationals. At first, he actually goes to Tennessee State in the late 50s, which is a historically black what they call today an HBCU, a historically black college and university. The team wins the NAIA, which is kind of like a little sister to the NCAA tournament, but the team wins it 2 years, 58 and 59, and they're the first historically black college to win an integrated men's basketball title. Then goes on to Syracuse for a couple of years, and then in 61 he jumps to the rival American Basketball League. He goes to play for the Cleveland Pipers, who's a team we've talked about some in the past. The Pipers, who are owned by the future owner of the New York Yankees, George M. Steinbrenner III, wins an ABL title. I think the only full season of the ABL is that 1961-1962. Then he goes to the Lakers, where he's with Weston Baylor for a few years. In kind of the early-ish years, including 63. Actually, his first year with the team is 62-63, which is our random team episode that we did a few weeks back. He's there for a few years. That's where he earns the nickname Fallback Baby because of the way he shoots kind of a jump shot, kicking his legs up and falling back. He gets that nickname from the legendary Chick Hearn. And then he goes to the Knicks and has some good seasons. He's an all-star 1 year and in 68, and he's he is a really key player on the 70 team because this is before Monroe. It's Frazier and Barnett on the famous 70 Knicks team, the team that wins the very first championship. And he benefits when they bring Dave DeBusschere in. It kind of really spreads the floor. Frazier's reinvigorated. That helps Barnett. And so even though he's not necessarily as loud of a personality as Frazier or even some of the other guys, a key part, especially of that first team.
The Fallback Baby thing is also interesting because there's some question because there's also a version of that where he said that to people who were guarding him. Mm-hmm. Like, that was the origin, like when he would shoot, like he knew it was going to go in, so he was saying fall back, baby,
fall back on defense. Yeah,
go on the other end of the court. It's interesting because I know about Dick Barnett and I know about the 70s and 73 teams, but I did not realize just how accomplished he was after basketball.
Yeah.
He, I guess, got a doctorate. He had 3 degrees. He wrote 23 books. He gave lectures all over the world. So, sometimes it says he spent years teaching as a master's in public administration from NYU. 91, he got a doctorate in education from Fordham. And these are heavyweight schools too. They're New York schools, which is kind of cool. But also these are not, let's give a doctorate to a guy who was a famous basketball player. I don't think Fordham or NYU would be doing that. Taught sports management, So again, just a lot of times we either kind of go, this guy had some trouble with the law later in his life, or maybe, he fell on some hard times and, was sleeping in his car. Like, I just want to mention a guy who really thrived in life after basketball too. So,
let me kind of give a coda on this on Barnett, a book called The City Game, which is written by a guy named Pete Axthelm, who's a famous sports writer and a guy who in and of himself ended up having a lot of issues. They actually did a really long article on him in Sports Illustrated a few years ago. You can look him up, Pete Axthelm. But he did this book called The City Game, and it's a really interesting take on a sports book because it's half about the Knicks of the 1970 season and half about street ball legends, playground legends of the same era. So like he'll write a chapter about the Knicks and then a chapter about the playground legends. It's really kind of a neat. It's a quick read. It's called The City Game by Pete Axthelm. But this is what he says about Barnett. He says, Barnett has written no books, opened no restaurants, and endorsed few products. His clothes are smart but conservative by comparison to Frazier's or Stallworth's. His narrow, goateed face peers out from no color spreads in magazines. He is articulate and analytical in his approach to the game, but he keeps his interpretations largely to himself. On a team of celebrities, he is a non-celebrity, and he likes it that way. As long as management and the other players appreciate me, he says, I'm satisfied. I don't go overboard about the publicity stuff. And then Red Holzman says, Barnett has raw talent, brains, desire, and coachability. It's a pity more people don't recognize how outstanding he is. I think that's a good way to sum up Dick Barnett.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and why don't we move on? And I think Andrew is up to read next.
Sure. Jim Marshall, born in 1937, passed away on June 3rd. Marshall started defensive end for the Minnesota Vikings for 20 seasons and played in 4 Super Bowls with the team. He holds all-time records for opponents' fumbles recovered, consecutive starts, and games played by a defensive player. Coach Bud Grant called Marshall the greatest Viking we ever had.
A player who a lot of people think should be in the Hall of Fame plays in every Viking game over 19 seasons. So this is a defensive lineman, basically 2 decades. Unofficially, because they weren't counted as an official stat till Lawrence Taylor came around in the 1980s. But unofficially, he has 130.5 career sacks and 30 fumble recoveries. Bud Grant says there'd be no Vikings without Jim Marshall.
And I've talked about this as a possibility for an episode sometime next year to just do an episode on that era of the Vikings, because the point I've always made is like what I know them as from what footage really predominantly survives from those Vikings teams and the NFL in that era, them getting destroyed in Super Bowls. Well, they made 4 Super Bowls and they were really good teams. And you could even put an even bigger point on that with Jim Marshall, which is, what do people know about Jim Marshall? He ran the wrong way and got a safety because he recovered a fumble and ran in the wrong end zone. I have some stats here for records from him. Most seasons played by a defensive player, 20. Most complete seasons, 20 by a defensive player. Most consecutive games started by a defensive player, 282. If you include playoffs, 289. He's also got that record. Most consecutive regular season starts by a defensive player. Most opponent fumbles recovered, 29, which was tied by Jason Taylor. Most fumble recoveries by a defensive end, 30. And then, okay, let's throw this in. Most yardage lost on a fumble recovery, 66. But also I want to point out they won that game. So it didn't end up killing them, the game that he went the wrong way. But he was a second-team All-Pro, 1964, 1968, 1969. He was also a Pro Bowler in 68 and 69. And one of the best. He was also won a national championship at Ohio State in 1957. And I mean, still probably one of the best handful of Vikings of all time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And his durability on the field is all the more impressive when you factor in some of the things that he went through in his life when he was in his career. He was a very adventurous guy. He liked to do sort of adventurous things, and he estimated, and I don't have the number. This is from Wikipedia, but again, I'll trust it. But he was estimated at where he said he admitted to having jumped out of airplanes 2,067 times. At some point, I feel like you'd stop counting. I would stop counting at 0 because I would never do it. But 2,067, he when he was with the Cleveland Browns, he had to be put in a medically induced coma to save his life because he was suffering from encephalitis. In 1971, he is on a snowmobiling expedition when he gets stranded. He and some other players, they get stranded with their group. They burn money to survive because it's the only thing they have that will burn. And then I also read, as I was just reading this thing, that it said, quote, he also recovered at some point from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And I was like, did he try and kill himself? No, he just had an accident. He was doing something with a gun, and he accidentally shot himself, I think, in like the leg or something, or there's a shoulder or whatever it was. So he had to recover from that too. So he really, you do kind of wonder if maybe he was able to deal with the wrong way thing in such good humor because he had nearly died so many times. So you think maybe that was some way that he he wasn't going to let something silly like running the wrong way with a fumble impact the way he felt about himself after all he had been through. Plus, if you believe the stats, he recovered 30 fumbles in his career, so it's not like it was his only chance ever with the ball.
Yeah, so a couple of interesting things. It's during that game that they won against the 49ers where he ran the wrong way, they won 27-22. This was largely thanks to Marshall sacking 49ers quarterback George Myra and forcing a fumble, which was recovered by Carl Eller, who ran 45 yards to the touchdown. So he more than made up for it. I thought this was nice that he got a letter from a guy, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm going to assume it's Regals, from Roy Regals.
Mm-hmm.
Had a similar wrong way run in the 1929 Rose Bowl. And he wrote, "Welcome to the club." And I believe that cost his team probably the only points in the game. No, it was 8-7. Coach's name was Nibs Price. But yeah, they in the 1929 Rose Bowl, a similar play happened. So I just thought that was interesting. One other, this is more of a trivia thing, but you mentioned the thing that happened in 1971 with the snowmobiling.
Yeah.
One who was with him was a sports writer named Jim Klobuchar, who's the father of the current Minnesota U.S. Senator.
Yeah, he was a very prolific sports writer. He wrote a couple books on the Vikings at that time period. He was not, he wasn't one of these guys. It's like, oh, my dad was a sports writer. In fact, he was, an insurance agent who wrote a couple stories when he was in his 20s. He was an honest to God, well-known, especially for the Vikings, an honest to God, well-known Minnesota sports writer.
Yeah. And I mean, you talked about the durability. When did he play until like 1980 or something like that?
I think 79 was his last year. I think he basically played with the Vikings. He played with the Browns in 60. And then I think he was basically on the Vikings for all of the 60s and all of the 70s.
Yep. Yes. Yep. 79 was his last year. And in his last year, he started every single game, as you would expect. So, a legendary, a career, especially within the context of the Vikings. Again, if it's a lot of people will just go, oh, the guy ran the wrong way, but there was a lot more to a really good career besides that. And again, they won that game anyway, and he made a huge play in the game.
And I purposefully did not put that in the introduction. I knew it would come up, obviously, but I thought that he deserved to be considered it. And you have to hope, I don't think this is the case, but you have to hope that that's not what keeps him out of the Hall of Fame. You have to hope that that's not what the reason is why he hasn't gotten. And I don't even know, maybe if you look at it on balance, I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems like a guy who played 19 years and was an all pro and was a pro bowler and had all those sacks and fumble recoveries. To me, it seems like, he should be in the Hall of Fame, and there's plenty of other guys from those Vikings teams in the Hall of Fame, but you just would have to hope that that's not the reason he hasn't gotten in.
Well, we'll find out, because if they're going to put him in, they're going to do it soon, because they love to put guys in right after they die.
That's a good point. All right, well, we are moving right along here. I'd say we're coming down the home stretch, but we only have 2 more to do tonight, but I don't know how these will actually get chopped up, so who knows? Probably we're coming to the end of an episode, and I am going to talk about Gerry Philbin, who was born in 1941 and died on June 25th. A member of the all-time AFL team, Philbin played 9 seasons with the New York Jets. Perhaps his best year was in 1968 when he amassed 14 and a half sacks, most in the AFL, and was named a first-team All-AFL selection. The Jets won Super Bowl III that same year.
Yeah, so another guy who, we've had in addition to a lot of off-field guys, we've had a lot of New York guys in this first half of this in memoriam. AFL All-Star 1968 and 1969, like you said, 14 and a half sacks in 1968, which is a very big number then, now, forever, a big number. I would say, especially at the time, they didn't pass as much, but in the AFL, they passed plenty. Obviously a part of the first and only Jets championship in 1968 and Super Bowl III. Not a name that I think a lot of people, to be honest, including myself, are super familiar with. But a guy who, within the context of the Jets, he's in the Jets Ring of Honor. He's, again, had his best years at a time when the Jets were having the most successful teams they ever had in the late 60s. Was part of the Jets' second Ring of Honor class, to just sort of contextualize where he was within the franchises, where they consider him within the hierarchy of the all-time of the New York Jets.
Yeah, and this is what I had jumped up to grab from a book. Only Joe Namath, Weeb Eubank, Don Maynard, Winston Hill, Curtis Martin, and Joe Klecko, all of whom were inducted into 2010, preceded him into the team's Ring of Honor. Those are all, now that Klecko's gotten in, those are all now Hall of Famers. And so he was probably the best defensive player on the 68 Jets when they did the America's game on NFL Network a few years back of the 68 Jets. They had Namath, obviously. They had Don Maynard, Namath's great Hall of Fame receiver. And then the guy they had from the defense was Gerry Philbin. So that is kind of, that you don't hear a lot about that 68 Jets defense because there's no Hall of Famers. Plus, Namath just kind of takes up so much of the oxygen. But possibly the guy who was once described as a colossal overachiever, Gerry Philbin, is possibly the best defensive player on that team.
Yeah, and the thing to think about with Super Bowl III specifically is that was a very low-scoring game. I mean, even the Jets only scored 16 points in that game. So it was the defense really that won them that game, keeping Earl Morrall and the high-powered Colts offense to 7 points. So, obviously a collective effort from the defense, but Philbin was one of the anchors of that defense. And from the Jets obituary, or not obituary, but like the article the Jets website had upon his death, they had some quotes from some interesting guys, Rex Ryan being one of them, because obviously Rex Ryan's dad was an assistant on that 68 team, just talking about Philbin and the toughness and the sort of overachieving nature, from what, like you said, but maybe not a guy with a ton of great physical gifts, but certainly made the most out of what he did have.
Yeah, and I think your point was one that I was just about to make, which was that, while Namath gets the credit for the guarantee, it was the defense of the Jets who shut down the AFL Player of the Year and great Baltimore Colts offense that had dominated the NFL regular season. So, sort of like the Giants in Super Bowl 42, it's hard to give a whole unit MVP of a Super Bowl, but you'd like to think probably Philbin and his Jets defense maybe deserves a little more credit than they historically get.
Yeah, I think that's for sure.
All right, so moving right along here, we've got a little bit of a theme. Individuals who we much more often hear about football players, this time coming on to talk about athletes who meant a lot to them in other sports. But before we introduce our guest, Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit about our next honoree, Dave Parker?
Sure, Dan. Dave Parker, born in 1951, passed away on June 28th. Parker began his career with the Pittsburgh Pirates, where he made 4 All-Star teams and won the 1978 MVP and 1979 World Series. He later won a World Series in 1989 as the designated hitter for the Oakland Athletics. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in January 2025, only a few months before his death.
We are lucky to be joined right now by a native of the Western Pennsylvania area, host of the Pigskin Dispatch on the Sports History Network, along with a bunch of other stuff that he's done, and also a published author these days, Darin Hayes. So we'll get to all that a little bit later on. But first off, Darin, thanks for joining us again and doing this year.
Guys, I really appreciate being invited to come on again and to talk about a guy that was a childhood hero of mine here, with some great Pirates teams in the late 1970s.
So yeah, give us your memory. You were a fan. You grew up around this time period. Grew up watching, Pittsburgh sports and the Pirates. Give us your initial thoughts, memories, whatever, on Dave Parker.
I was right at the most impressionable age you can probably be as a sports fan. I was like 12, 13 years old in the 78, 79 years. And Dave Parker was, this guy was bigger than life. I mean, he was a big man, and he wasn't even he was a power hitter, but he didn't usually bat in the 4-hole because you had Willie Stargell usually batting in the 4-hole. But he was known as the Cobra, and I can remember every single time that he would come up to bat, they would play like that Swami, like Indian, snake charming music every time he would come up, and the Pirates announcers would go crazy. But he would come up at the biggest moments, and I think my biggest memory is probably I think it was a 79 All-Star game. At the end of the game, he's playing right field. Gary Carter's behind the plate. I can't remember who the batter is for the American League, but they hit a shot out to right field, and it's the score. The winning run is rounding third, ready to come in, and Parker, on a dime, throws to the plate from deep in right field to Carter, who tags out the runner at the plate, and the National League wins the game. And he was just amazing. I think Game 2 against Cincinnati in the 79 NLCS, he hit a home run late in the game that put the Pirates over the edge. Of course, they won that series 3-0 over the Reds. But he always came through at such clutch situations, and that's what I really remember about him.
It's interesting, the Pirates and I'd never really thought of it in this context, but like, in a 20-year period, the Pirates won 3 titles, basically 10 years apart, give or take a year. And it was like almost it probably was an entirely different team each time. So like, depending on when you were born, within like you had your team, guys of a certain age, it was that 60 team. Then the next sort of half generation was the 71 team. And then everybody else, it was the next youngest group, it was the 79 team. And if you're any younger than that, you're pretty much out of luck with the Pirates so far. But it seems like that 79 team, the late 70s Pirates specifically, just the guys on that team just resonate so much with like the era and the zeitgeist, I guess, of baseball in that time.
Yeah, they definitely did. I mean, you had great lineup. I can almost remember the batting order, because I listened almost every night on the radio. You had Omar Moreno leading off and Phil Garner, coming in the two-hole, Parker, Stargell, Bill Robinson, and you had great pitching too, like Kent Tekulve and Candelaria were pitching on that team. So just a great team in the family. The We Are Family was the Sister Sledge song, was really popular that year, and they were the family. They had it posted everywhere around Three River Stadium. I even got to go down to a couple games that year, and it was awesome to go down there. It was a great family atmosphere, and you felt it. You really felt connected to that team.
It's funny you hear about that We Are Family, and the thing that always reminds me of, and this is a little bit far afield, but when The Wire came out about 20 years ago, based in Baltimore, and they used We Are Family as the theme song of one of the mayoral candidates in Baltimore. And after the episode aired, they were asking David Simon, the creator, they said basically, you must be insane thinking that any politician in Baltimore would use the theme song of the 1979 Pirates, not be run out of town. So that's always what I think of. And, it's rare to have a pop song that's associated with a team, even 35 some odd years later. But, you talk about that team, they are the We Are Family Pirates. And the two great offensive stars of the team were Stargell, who was co-MVP in 1979, and Dave Parker, who had been the MVP of the league the year before. Those are really the two guys, and, for years, Stargell was the only guy from that whole lineup who was in the Hall of Fame. And finally, just this year, just a few months before his death, Dave Parker was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And it wasn't one of these situations where he was one of these guys who was inducted, shortly after his death. He was inducted after his death, but he actually was elected, before he passed away. So at least he got to be aware of the fact that he was a Hall of Famer. The other thing is Darin mentioned his arm. He had 26 outfield assists in 1977, which was the record for outfielders. Or maybe not the record, but it was the highest that anybody had for a quarter century. So it took him a long time to get into the Hall of Fame. He was suffering from, I believe it was Parkinson's for the last several years of his life. But happily enough, he at least was able to be aware of the fact that he had been elected to the Hall of Fame just a few short months before he passed away.
Yeah, it was really very reminiscent of and kind of sad. I almost parallel it to almost like Franco Harris. Just days before Franco Harris's numbers immaculate reception celebration, he passes. Parker's getting ready to go into Hall of Fame induction. He passes. Just days before they go in there. Kind of sad to see your heroes go down like that, and you want to see them have that glory moment where they get to stand up, but. They're not forgotten. I mean, these guys are Pittsburgh guys, and it really, it really broke our heart when he went to Cincinnati and having to see him in a Reds uniform for a few years. Especially after what he did to the Reds for like a decade. He just tortured those guys, but that was kind of painful too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he was from Cincinnati. I think he was born in the Deep South, but grew up in the Cincinnati area. This is the very early days of free agency. 83, I believe, was his last year with Pittsburgh. And this isn't really the forum for it, but I know there were some issues with drug use, and he was involved in a drug scandal with cocaine, and his, weight had kind of gotten up, and, a little bit of a falling out with the fans of Pittsburgh. And then he goes to what at their time is their biggest rival. And he kind of has a little bit of a resurgence there, and also ends up, as we mentioned in the intro, even after that, ends up with the late 80s Oakland A's. So another, real interesting group of guys in the collection of baseball history, and picks up another championship, but will always really be remembered as a Pirate for the most part, and one of the icons of that 1979 late 70s Pirates team.
He was he was fantastic. Like I said, as a kid, you don't know about, when you're a kid, you don't think about the drug use and what these guys are doing, carousing and everything. You're watching them play ball and seeing what they do on the field. And that's the purest form of fandom, I think. And you can just appreciate it. I mean, there's no ESPN back there. There's no cell phones or social media. You just have the newspaper and what you watch, on TV and listen to on the radio on the Pirates broadcast. And he was just, to me, he was a hero, and he was a great player.
One of the things that he was definitely very representative of was that those A's teams of the late 80s, early 90s, they brought in a lot of guys as sort of role players around the Henderson, McGuire, Canseco type. You had Dave Henderson, who had been in Boston in a World Series. A couple years later is with the A's. Parker leaves at the end of the 89 season, but then they bring in Harold Baines for the 90 season, who's another future Hall of Famer. And then mid-season, they bring in another guy who was not a Hall of Famer, and is not a Hall of Famer, but was the MVP with the Cardinals in 82, and that's Willie McGee. So they really did bring in a lot of sort of veteran type guys. Reminded me a lot of the Yankees of, 5 or 6 years later in that way, when the way the Yankees would bring in Raines and Strawberry and Chili Davis and those type of guys. So that was something that was really a hallmark of those A's teams of the late 80s and early 90s. And then the other thing about Parker is he was a character. I mean, he said things, somebody asked him a question midsummer. I think it was something about a hitting slump. And he said, when the leaves turn down, I'll be wearing the batting crown. Meaning that he would be, he would win the batting title at the end of the year. He also said one time that he was talking about people talking and stuff in the clubhouse, and he said, "Well, about 90% of the verbalizing in the clubhouse is done by me." And then the final thing is, and this, I think you can still get a T-shirt with this on it. He said, "If you hear any noise, it's just me and the boys bopping." And I think he actually not only said that, but he put that on a T-shirt at one point. So a character, a great player, and a guy who I was glad was able to see his own Hall of Fame status shortly before he passed away.
Some player definitely wore that shirt within the last few years in warm-ups. I don't know if it was a Pirate or somebody else, but I remember that exact shirt recently.
Yeah. Something else was kind of amazing that I just found out recently, I think right around his death. He was the first $1 million a year American sports athlete.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of an amazing thing. Today we look at it, that's what, guys in their first year make when they're coming out of college. But back then, that was a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Things have changed a lot just in our lifetimes. Before we wrap this up, Darin, you are a prolific member of the Sports History Network. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcasts, what you do for the network, all that type of stuff.
Well, the main thing is Pigskin Dispatch podcast. We have pigskindispatch.com to go with it, YouTube channel, and we're on social media quite a bit. And like you mentioned earlier, we have a couple books out. Well, we have 5 books out right now. 2 of them this year are 100th anniversary books. One is Marooned that I wrote with Jeff Payne. And, it's about the 1925 Pottsville Maroons and 100th anniversary of their stolen championship year. And also helped out on a book that Chris Willis wrote of NFL Films on Red Grange and the Chicago Bears in the 100th anniversary of the barnstorming tour that they did. So both those are out on Amazon. You can look under my name or under Chris Willis's or Jeff Payne's name respectively and get those books. But Great celebration of some 100 years of football history.
And Darin sells himself short a little bit here. I would just note that the Pro Football Resources Association, who is a group that he and I are both part of, and other members, including George Bazika, who's on our network and is the president of it, they give out an award every year for the best pro football book of the year. And there's some pretty well-known books on this list. And the most recent honoree is Darin's book about the 1903 Franklin All-Stars, the world's greatest pro gridiron team. So it's Darin has been very prolific in the world of pro football history and research over the last couple of years.
Well, thank you. It's very kind. I was very humbled by that honor, and I did not expect that at all. So I thank the PFRE, and I thank you for recognition too.
Absolutely. Well, football is his mainstay, but he's also a Pittsburgh sports fan, and so we appreciate him coming on to talk to us about Dave Parker.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Darin. Take care. All right. Well, thanks to Darin, and now we're gonna do something a little bit different here, and I'll let Andrew do the introduction or read the summary, and then we'll talk about why we felt we needed to include this individual, and then just talk about his life and legacy a little bit. So, Andrew, take it away.
Terry Bollea, born in 1953, died on July 24th. Wrestling professionally as Hulk Hogan, he is perhaps the most well-known professional wrestler in history. He rose to prominence in early 1984 when he first won the WWF title and would remain the promotion's top performer until the early 1990s. He later moved on to WCW, where his heel turn and founding of the NWO led to a renaissance in his career and the most successful non-WWF wrestling promotion of the last half century.
So first of all, Andrew is the wrestling history expert here. I know some stuff. I'm not completely ignorant, but Andrew knows a lot about sort of the history going back and the territories and all that type of thing. But as we were putting this together, I didn't know whether we wanted to include Hulk Hogan on the list. And, but wrestling is not fake in the sort of traditional, it's not like shooting a movie. The guys who do it, they get hurt. They injure themselves. It is a very, very difficult way to make a living. And so in some ways, professional wrestlers have more in common with athletes, competing in sports than they do with actors or that type of thing. On the other hand, it's not a sport. It's got a predetermined outcome. It's not a competitive endeavor in that way. And the other thing too is that, I think Andrew and I, with the exception of our sort of yearly recaps where we always get a little bit of information on pro wrestling, this isn't a wrestling podcast. It's a sports history podcast. And the question is, well, if you include Hulk Hogan, who else do you have to include? Who else? But I think that Hulk Hogan is unique in that he was such a crossover. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He was a guy who, at least in his time, especially with kayfabe and maybe not everybody realizing that wrestling wasn't a sport, he got the publicity of a sports star probably in a way that nobody else did, I would say, through the history of pro wrestling, at least not, since the 1920s, maybe.
Yeah. So wrestling is such a tough thing to talk about. And the irony of Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea being one of the guys who sort of propagated this, just always say things in the media, whether they're true or not. He certainly was one of the propagators of this, but you want to tell the story. You also don't want to talk about it as if it were a real competition, but also you want to, you don't want to oversimplify things. So for a long time, the WWE liked to push this narrative that, well, before Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan and WrestleMania, wrestling was a thing that was in smoky bars and clubs. And that's not true. Wrestling was very popular going back to the 20s. They had different eras of, increasing popularity, waning popularity in different parts of the country, huge arenas, baseball stadiums, selling out, things like that. They certainly didn't invent wrestling being popular. There had been other wrestlers, Gorgeous George in the 50s, who were mainstream stars. So there's no doubt that, Hulk Hogan was not the first wrestler that anybody had heard of. There was also no doubt that the WWF in the mid 80s was a cultural force unlike any wrestling company had ever been. And that was largely because of Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan looked so different than other people who'd been pushed as top wrestling stars before that. wrestling always had colorful characters, but the guys who were the top stars were usually still guys with amateur wrestling backgrounds. And Hogan was a big bleach blonde, tan, hugely muscled, billed as being from California, even though he was actually from Florida. And, had been really popular in the Midwest and the AWA. Came into the WWF within a month, was the champion, and again was on Sports Illustrated, hosted Saturday Night Live, led wrestling into some of the biggest boom periods of all time in the 80s. And I'm not, given what we're doing here, I won't go into. And then in '87 he worked a house show loop with Terry Funk or whatever, but like. WrestleMania 3 against Andre the Giant is still a match and a show that most people recognize as the biggest event in wrestling history. I always say when Hulk Hogan fought Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, after Bob Uecker announced him, as a callback to earlier in our episode, Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant are standing there facing each other. And the color commentator, Jesse Ventura, says, "This is the biggest match in the history of professional wrestling." And the thing I like to say always is that's the 9 millionth time in past and present in history that a wrestling announcer has said that about a match. And it's the only time it's actually been true. So he was a hugely popular star. He was in movies, mostly B movies, but he was all over TV.
B might be generous, but keep going.
The thing I also think back on is, as I've gotten older and I'm in some different wrestling nostalgia groups, is you forget just how much his name and face was on. You think about action figures and trading cards, but like somebody posted these things the other day and we had one, like a little like thing that like squirted water out the teeth that had Hulk Hogan's face on it, the Ultimate Warrior's face on it. It was like a little squish ball almost.
I don't remember that, but as you're talking about it, it's like vaguely familiar. It sounds right.
So he was a huge cultural force, and he also was, a big deal in wrestling, and he was one of the most successful wrestlers of all time. And then, just to move it along a little, his run with the WWF comes to an end. He goes to WCW, which was the other big wrestling company. And he still tries to do the like Hulk Hogan is, like it's still 1985 thing for a few years. And people are tired of it. The fans down there that maybe never liked Hulk Hogan are really tired of it. And he becomes a bad guy. And it was, looking back on it now, it was like, of course that's what they did. But at the time it was on like the network news the next day. It didn't lead off, but like they were like, oh, Hulk Hogan's a bad guy now. And it revitalized wrestling. It helped a late 90s wrestling boom. And he was in his 40s at this point and he couldn't do as much physically, but just him turning into this bad guy figure was another, again, huge cultural moment. So I still say, if you take anybody who's 40 to 70, who's not a wrestling person at all, and you walk up to them on the street and say, name a wrestler, they're going to say Hulk Hogan. And, there is no denying his impact on the wrestling business, how popular he was at his hottest, and how different the wrestling business looked when he was on top than it had looked even 2 years before that.
Well, and the other thing I was going to mention was that that NBC, that main event that they did, which was, they always did Saturday night's main event, which was where Saturday Night Live would take a night off and they would do a show on NBC, a WWF show that was, I think, 90 minutes. And it was, they were all great. They're all still available, on Peacock and, wherever else. But those were pre-recorded. They did a few that were called the main event, which were on Friday nights at 10 o'clock and they were live. And the first one they did was the rematch between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. And I think like 33 million people watched this. It was one of the astronaut. I think it's still the most people that have ever watched a pro wrestling event in history, but it was such a big event that, and look, I'm a little biased maybe because I was a wrestling fan most in that 80s, 90s period, but Hogan had a cultural relevance that even some of the most popular guys, I guess the one that everybody always talks about is Stone Cold Steve Austin. And he might have been just as popular as far as numbers, but I don't think he was as ubiquitous in the culture in 1998 or 1999 as Hulk Hogan was in 1985 or 1986.
And that main event special was the first time they'd been on network TV since the 50s.
Yeah, in 35 years or whatever it was, 30 years.
So, certainly when we talked about doing Hogan, we said, how many other wrestlers would we do? And of guys who are like, the only other one I could think that we would mention right now would be Ric Flair. If Stone Cold Steve Austin dies, we would talk about him, but Stone Cold Steve Austin's probably not. I mean, I guess with wrestlers, you never know. But like, there's a handful, but if you're going to do one, Hogan would be the one you would do.
Yeah, and even we were talking before when we did Al Trautwig about MSG Network, and I didn't bring it up in the context of Al Trautwig, first of all, because, again, wrestling, not entirely a sport. And second of all, Al Trautwig didn't have anything to do with WWF, but like,
worked under a hood for a while in 84.
Al Trautwig did. The intro to MSG Network in like 1990 was, I don't know if Messier was with the Rangers yet, but it was a Ranger scoring a goal. It was Patrick Ewing dunking. It was Don Mattingly hitting a home run. And then it was Hulk Hogan posing in the ring at Madison Square Garden. So it was a part of things in sports, on the MSG Network in a way that I'll never forget. Here's something interesting. In Martin Luther King Day, 1990, I was in first grade. And I remember I was all excited because on the MSG Network that day, there was a Knick game in the afternoon and then wrestling at night. And I don't know, I guess I'll spoil the surprise, but if anybody knows what I'm talking about, the MSG Knick game, which was against the Bulls in 1990, was the Trent Tucker game, where he's hit a three-pointer with 0.1 seconds remaining. And then that night, there was wrestling at Madison Square Garden, and I'm sure Hogan was on the card. Wrestling was that for a New Yorker, for a young sports fan. If you were also into wrestling, it was part of it. I guess that's the way I can always put it. It was like, it was part of it in those days.
Mr. Perfect with the Genius defeated WWF World Champion Hulk Hogan via disqualification at 13:36 after Hogan hit the challenger with his own pair of brass knuckles. Moments after Perfect used them behind the referee's back. The bell did not ring until after the champion hit the leg drop and made the cover.
And is the date on that January 15th, 1990?
Yes.
Yeah. So same day as the Trent Tucker game. So, you have to think that would have been cool. That would have been really cool to just be at MSG for the day to see the Trent Tucker game against the Bulls. Again, they're not champions yet. They're still a year away from that, but still against the Bulls. And then that night you get to see Hogan wrestle Mr. Perfect among other things. So the legacy of Hulk Hogan is, again, and there's complexities to who he was in his personal life and all that stuff, but that's, to a certain degree, that's neither here nor there as far as what we wanted to highlight about him here.
Exactly.
Well, during his wrestling career, especially in the 1980s when he was at his most popular, Hulk Hogan was often the last match of the night on the big events. We're going to stick with that theme here and make his tribute the final segment of our 2025 In Memoriam, part number 1. I want to thank Darin, Bob, Chuck, and Dana for joining us over the past couple of hours, and of course my co-host Andrew for joining me as always. For Andrew, I'm Dan Newman. We'll see you for part 2 in a few weeks. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, aka the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.